We are now live.
Hi.
1 second. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today on Small Talk as I speak with Shri TT Srinivasaraghavan, MD and CEO of Sundaram Finance, one of the most well-respected NBFC in India. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time out and agreeing to speak to me.
Thanks, Amit. Pleasure to be on Small Chat, Small Talk.
Yeah, thank you. Sir, today I want to talk to you about your journey in the vehicle finance space, the foundations that make Sundaram Finance a safe haven in these volatile times, and the impact of COVID-19 on the vehicle finance space. Before I start, I wanted to remind the audience that we will have a Q&A session at the end of this chat, and you could either type your questions in the questions section or you could click on the raise hand icon that you see on the right side of the screen. So, sir, why don't we start with going down the memory lanes, and if you could talk about your initial days in the vehicle finance space, what was your first role at Sundaram Finance, and what were some of the learnings from those initial years that sort of build the foundation of your career? That would be interesting to learn.
If I can push that timeline back a little more, I started life as a banker, actually. It was 1977. Yeah, so
Wow.
A long time ago. Yeah. That's where I started in banking, retail banking, and then moved to Sundaram Finance in 1983, February 1983. And oddly, I did not start my life in Sundaram Finance in the vehicle finance business.
Wow.
We were actually just then setting up an equipment leasing business.
Right.
It was the time, early days when IFC Washington had come to India, and they wanted to promote the concept of equipment leasing.
Okay.
So they were in dialogue with one company in each region. So in the south it was Sundaram, in the west it was 20th Century Leasing, so on and so forth. So as part of that diversification into leasing, Sundaram Finance was looking for young professionals, I guess, and I applied for that. That's how I actually came into Sundaram Finance. So that had nothing to do with vehicle finance.
Right.
So my journey in 1983 in Sundaram Finance started as marketing manager in the equipment leasing or equipment finance business. So
Right.
that's where my journey started.
Right.
And of course, it was a very tiny piece of the overall. I mean, it was clearly we were a hire purchase company, and our entire focus was on vehicle financing. Leasing was a little adjunct, so there wasn't any tightly drawn lines. So from day one, though my specific job responsibility was equipment leasing, my colleagues were all very much vehicle finance guys. So I grew up with the smell, if you like, and the touch and the feel of trucking. I mean, that's who Sundaram Finance was, and if you were any kind of Sundaram Finance guy, then you were part of that mahol of trucking.
Right.
So by and by, I'm still predominantly a leasing guy, right? Who was slowly learning about the tricks of the vehicle financing trade. And I guess it was only sort of in the mid-90s that I sort of came full-time into truck financing. At that time, it wasn't vehicle financing. It was just truck financing.
Right.
And, just around the time when that big debacle happened in the commercial vehicle industry. So 96, 97. So in a sense, for me, it was a baptism by fire, right? Just as I was getting fully into the trucking business, the commercial vehicle industry just went for a toss, and that coincided with the CRB capital markets crash. To,
Right.
I mean, I don't know how many of the people in the audience are, old enough or were around at that time to recall the CRB capital. I mean, it was, in a sense, the DHFL or the ILFS of, you
That
know,
time.
of the 20th century. That's right. It
Right.
was a big crash, and it created quite a bit of disruption. And in fact, that sort of paved the way for a lot of the regulatory changes that happened. Till then, NBFCs were sort of regulated only from the deposit side, right? The asset side, there was virtually no restriction, no regulation. So
Okay.
this effectively paved the way. Uh, so that's where really my, hardcore involvement in vehicle financing started.
Mhm.
And of course, as I said, 97 was the absolute low point of both commercial vehicles and vehicle finance, because the kind of losses that people took at that time, the number of NBFCs went out of business. It was a very defining moment for as the high purchase companies, as we were known in those times.
Right.
NBFC is terminology that sort of came after that. In the 90s, we were still known as high purchase and leasing companies,
Right.
right? That
Right.
was the nomenclature.
Right. 20th century probably was a dominating NBFC at that time.
They were more of a leasing company,
Right.
right? Whereas guys like us were more the traditional high purchase companies,
Right.
right?
Right.
20th century is one of the new
Right.
generation companies, if you like.
Right. The depressing picture that you painted of 96, 97 sounds quite similar to current scenario.
It is. It's not completely different. You're right.
So fantastic. And so you're saying around 95, 96 is when you became in charge of the vehicle finance business at Sundaram.
Yeah,
And if you were to talk about some of the learnings that came out of that period, uh, uh, that would be very helpful. A lot of people would be looking for guidance on how to navigate this period.
absolutely. They're big learnings, I would say. As I said, in a sense, it was a baptism by fire.
Right.
Uh, there couldn't have been a worse time for somebody to be taking charge, of a vehicle financing business. But by the same token, I think in terms of learning, it was invaluable, right? Because in good times, these are things that you don't look at all.
Yeah.
So what that brought home to us very clearly was that, you know, how whatever may be the compulsions for growth, whatever may be the compulsions for scale, it was absolutely critical that you stayed with the stuff that you understood, right?
Right.
Much of the mess that happened then was people entering the business without understanding the risks. It was people who thought, if you built scale, somehow magically things would get taken care of. And anecdotally, I can tell you, it got so bad that people were lending money to dealers, to to anyone, to a bookstore wala, because they thought buying a truck was somehow the road to nirvana. And then, when the bust up happened, obviously these loans went bad, but a lot of the NBFCs packed up because this was not their core competence, right? I mean, a few slickly made PowerPoint presentations didn't prepare you for the grind of what was happening on the street, right? So
Absolutely.
that I think was a very, very important learning. The second thing which I think came through very clearly is that in this business, I mean, and it's a thin line, right? All of us are ambitious, all of us are aspirational, we want to grow. All of that is correct. But there is a line between ambition and greed. And I think if you look at it then, and if you look at what's happening today, and if you look at what happened during the global financial crisis, it is whenever people cross that line and it went from, as I say, ambition to greed, is when people paid the price. And even more frighteningly, if there was a combination of arrogance and greed, that became a toxic mix.
Right.
Right? And we've seen any number of instances of that, globally. We've seen instances in our own markets. And this is not necessarily only in financial services, but it's probably most visible in financial services when people think somehow they've become God, right? And they can make no mistakes. And always, but always, I think the market comes back and teaches you these lessons, sometimes very hard lessons, as we've seen, over these years.
Right. No, you absolutely said it. Ambition, arrogance, and growth put together are very uh, toxic cocktail. Uh,
Yes.
we will talk more about that when we talk about the foundations of Sundaram. But so 95, 96, you started taking care of the vehicle finance business, and you probably spent a decade in that role before taking over as CEO.
7 years to be precise.
7 years,
Yeah,
right? Right,
2003 is when I moved into the CEO's role.
right.
But I don't know if you have a follow-up question, but I must say here that what made it relatively easy for me to move into my role was that I had arguably the best mentor, teacher that anyone has probably had in their lives. This was my predecessor, Mr. G.K. Raman, who was a legend
Right,
in the industry. And
right.
he virtually handpicked me. He groomed me for this job. And as I say, when the transition happened, people now say that it was a seamless transition. I myself don't remember because I guess I was so excited at that time. But if it is true that it was seamless, I think all of the credit belongs to Mr. Raman, because it was he who literally taught me the nuts and bolts of this business. And through those 7 years, I was literally his shadow, right?
Right.
Wherever he went, whichever meeting, whether it was relevant to me or not, he took me along, right? Because he wanted me to understand not only the vehicle financing part of the business, but the overall breadth of what a leader's role is, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that to me was probably one of the most invaluable things, in my entire career. The fact that I had someone like Mr. Raman to hold my hand and to groom me and mentor me for this role. So, if history judges me as, a successful manager, I think a very significant part of that credit would belong to Mr. Raman.
That's you at your humble best. Uh, so, sir, when you sort of started as CEO of Sundaram, what were the key things that you sort of set out to achieve? And as you look back as your at your career as a CEO, how do you feel about it?
See, there are two or three things that changed significantly around that time. One, as I said, was the regulation. Thanks to CRB and that fiasco, regulation became much tighter, right? Suddenly, we had prudential norms, we had 30 DPD, 60 DPD, stuff that we had never heard before, right? and you had exposure norms. It sort of started sounding like bank regulation. Till then, NBFC regulation had been really light touch.
Right.
So this changed dramatically post CRB. So that was one thing. Number two, there was also the Y2K, which was hanging over our heads. So technology became a very big part of our lives, right? Because first to begin with, there was the fear of Y2K and what was going to happen during the cutover. But once that was passed, then technology itself became a big driver of business. And number three, competition. Because till the end of the 90s, competition in the NBFC, especially in the vehicle financing space, basically meant other NBFCs, right? Some were captives, which is, or at least promoted by the auto manufacturers.
Right.
Others promoted by industrial groups, and
Right.
some like us were standalone. But basically, the competition was amongst NBFCs, big, small, medium.
Yeah.
But after the turn of the century, you suddenly had players like ICICI Bank,
Yeah.
you had HDFC Bank.
Right.
Citibank was already there on and off, but they came in. GE Capital, which was an MNC.
Right.
So the contours of competition changed very dramatically.
Right.
So, in a sense, suddenly it became a David and Goliath type of scenario, where on the one hand you had these big, massive banks, with their unlimited ability virtually
Right.
to raise resources, right? And obviously, CASA and everything else, so the cost of funds advantage that they clearly had.
Right.
And us, on the other hand, whose relationships with the customers, our ability to source, our nimbleness, etc., were our strengths. So this was the battle that we were fighting with these guys. So that is something that changed dramatically.
Right.
So I would say, between the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, these are some of the big changes that happened. And it coincided with the growth of passenger car financing in the country. Because till the 90s, though you very charitably say vehicle financing, it was basically truck financing, right? And there
Yeah.
weren't that many cars being manufactured. I mean, Premier Padmini used to sell 25,000 cars. Ambassador sold another 25,000 cars, I think. Maruti, it's only after Maruti came on the picture, then the numbers started expanding. But in the 90s, Maruti numbers were still modest. But towards
Yeah.
the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, the car market suddenly expanded, the two-wheeler market exploded. So suddenly, for lenders, high purchase companies like ourselves, the market expanded from just doing truck finance to vehicle finance. So that changeover also, in a sense, happened only in the early part of the 2000s. So,
So,
yeah,
so
go ahead.
that diversification was probably one of the key things that you handled as a CEO. Is that uh,
Diversification in two ways.
yeah.
One was this, moving away from being virtually a 100% truck financing company to a broader vehicle financing company.
Right.
Equally, the diversification based on a very extensive survey that we did in
Okay.
97. What came back from our customers was, in simple terms, Sundaram, we love you. We love dealing with you. The experience is fantastic. But you're basically a, almost a two-dimensional company, right? On the one hand, you do truck financing, fantastic. On the other hand, you accept deposits and take care of our deposits brilliantly. But life is changing, right? There's other things happening in the world. There's mutual funds, there's insurance, there's mortgage financing.
Right.
We think somebody like Sundaram should be offering us all of these things.
Right.
So that kind of started us off on our whole diversification journey.
Right.
So if you look at it, 1995-96, we set up our asset management business. 1999, we set up our housing finance business. And in 2000, when insurance opened up, the general insurance business.
Right.
So I was sort of very deeply involved in all of these diversifications. In fact, during that part of my transition into the CEO role, a lot of my time was actually going because in all of these JV partners were involved. So much of the JV negotiations, putting together the team was all very much part of my remit at that time. And again, that was huge learning, just negotiating each of these joint ventures, setting up the businesses from literally from ground up. So that was another very important phase of my learning journey.
Right. Interesting. So, with Sundaram sort of spreading its wings across segments within the vehicle space, and also diversifying into newer asset classes like home, general insurance, you've done all that diversification. What do you see Sundaram as over the next 10, 20 years? What are your unfulfilled ambitions for it? Is you mentioned about banks coming into this space and they having significant cost of fund advantage. I'm sure Sundaram would have evaluated banking or SFB licenses at multiple point in time, and I'm sure it's a considered call. But just wanted to understand your thoughts on what would Sundaram look like, let's say 10 or 20 years down the line.
Well, it will take a brave man to guess, even in normal times. In these COVID times, it will take a very bold, brave man. I'm not going to hazard that guess. But it goes back to something that I said earlier in the conversation. My belief is that if you do one or two or three things well, just focus on becoming the best at those one, two, or three things, right? Because there was a time, in my career when the buzz was, in the early days, it was about core competence. Then it became about conglomerate. And now again, I think it's going back to core competence, right? My belief uniformly, and when I say it's not just my personal belief, I think the belief in Sundaram Finance as a group has been pick the things that you know well, pick the things that fit with your DNA, and try to be the best you can. I mean, I'm not saying that we are the best, but I think the endeavor continuously is to be the best that you can, right? And, obviously, as I love to tell my people, I mean, this is a line I picked up years ago. Excellence has no finish line, right? Excellence is a pursuit, and that's what we try to do, right? Try and push the line further and further till, and people often ask me in terms of ambition, right? Do you want to be number one? To me, number one is a very illusory thing because today's number one can become tomorrow's number 100. We've seen the biggest of names slide, right, and disappear. I think Fortune 500 is a very good example of, I think the majority of the original Fortune 500 don't even exist,
Yeah.
right? I'm not a worshipper of size. I think and this is our stated position. This is what I tell my team. This is what I tell my boys. If we were to aspire to something, let's aspire to be the most respected player in our space, right? It doesn't have necessarily anything to do with size. I mean, obviously, there are going to be people who are much bigger than you, banks, NBFCs, whoever. So this is not a battle for size, but I think it is a battle for, as I said, being the most respected, which means what? Which means you're credible, which means that you're there for your customers, you're there for your stakeholders, when they most need you, right? So I
Absolutely.
think that is what we call the Sundaram promise. What I hope is that we can make the Sundaram promise every time, and we can live by the Sundaram promise every time.
Fantastic. And that brings me to the next phase that I really was looking forward to is what is it that makes Sundaram a safe haven? You mentioned in your last answer respect, credibility of with all stakeholders multiple times, and quite clearly you've done exceedingly well on that front. And even in these volatile times, you've seen that credibility sort of play out from various stakeholders, right? From whether it is from debt market, you are one of the few handpicked NBFCs who are still able to access capital market. Even if one looks at the equity market, while some of the most respected names have seen their share price go down by at least 50%, Sundaram Finance share price sort of continues to do well. All of it is sort of just a reflection of the faith, the credibility that you have, the respect that you command among your stakeholders. And while it's very nice to talk about, I know it takes decades of hard work to build that credibility. But would be get to good to get in summary from you two or three key things that some of the entrepreneurs and even the private equity investors who are there in the audience should take away as things to do or things to not do in that journey to bring that credibility.
Okay. Uh, See, yeah, as you say, this is probably our greatest strength. And I think it comes from a place of believing. And, I take very little credit for this because, I only came in the later part of the journey. These are the foundations that our founder laid. These are the foundations that people like Mr. Raman built on. So essentially, it was about saying, the customer is the center of your universe. And this was at a time in the 1950s when you didn't have CRM, right? You didn't have consultants,
Right.
peddling, customer ecstasy and delight and things like that. So this was the understanding of an entrepreneur whose simple dictum, and I remember this in the first week that I joined the company, there was a meeting. I think our total strength, company strength at that time was 100 people. So we all fitted into one hall. And, our founder chairman was still very active then. So while addressing him, a bunch of us new kids, so he said, the one thing I want you guys always to remember is that ultimately it is the customer who pays all our salaries. And he said all our salaries, including his.
Right.
He wasn't even a whole-time director, paid director in the company, but he said it is the customer who pays all our salaries. Never forget that. And that is an imprint which has stayed with me. I mean, it's getting on to 40 years. It's a lesson I've never forgotten. Every time I go, I try and go for every induction group of new joinees. Every time there's a new group, I go try to address them on day one, and I always share this story with them. That customer pays your salary. Don't. I'm not the guy who pays. MD is not paying your salary. HR is not paying your salary. It is your customer who's the boss. Right? So that was article of faith number one. Article of faith number two is that your people are your greatest assets. Right? People are not commodities which pick up and drop. So
Right.
which explains the longevity. Say in Sundaram Finance, in some other company, if I had said, this is my 38th year, people would say, wow. In Sundaram Finance, if I say 38th year, they'll say, yeah, but we've got guys who are 40, 42 years. Right? So it's not a big deal. I don't get any brownie points because of 38 years. But the point is longevity, and there's a reason for that. We've sort of consciously, and again, this is something that I've tried to propagate. I'm trying to embed completely. Is This is a Gurukul system, right? For those who understand what that means, we call it Gurukulam in Tamil, but Gurukul. So it is a system where the elders teach the freshers, right? So it's a hand-me-down type of knowledge, and I say this with great pride that we are a company. We don't have any toppers, we don't have gold medalists, and as I love to say, we are a bunch of ordinary guys doing, beyond ordinary things. And I'm very much part of that. I was never a topper in school, college. I never won any gold medal, right? So we are essentially a team of guys, who don't have fancy records, but I think there is a deep bond with the institution, a deep commitment to our customers, and a commitment to the Sundaram way, as we call it. And I think it is that which in some way explains, what you're asking. Why do people stay? Why is it safe haven? And in a sense, if anecdotally, maybe this is a good thing to point out. Now, COVID times on see for the last 20 years, I think that is one of the things that I brought about, was in the old days, the annual appraisals, etc., used to be completed, and by the time the raises and everything else were announced, it used to be June or July. So I went to Mr. Raman one day and said, "Sir, I would like to do this on April 1." So he said, "You're foolish. You'll never be able to do this. How can you? So many hundreds of or thousands of people. How will you complete appraisals? How will you do this?" I said, "No, we can." He said, "It's up to you. If you think you can do it, do it." So I worked with our HR team, and we actually managed one year. I think it was 1998, 99. April 1, we announced everything. So from then on, it became a thing that we should do it. And every year, unfailingly, on April 1, every employee in the company, whoever he is, whichever rank, whichever location, he will get his appraisal, reward, everything on April 1. So now when we came to April 1, 2020, or approaching
That
April
would
1,
be interesting.
same thing. So what are we going to do? And we're locked out, right? We're not even in office. So we had this conversation, my senior colleagues, HR head, all of us, and gentle feeling was, you forget it, right? In this madness, we can't do this. We can do it because at that time we thought by April 14th we'll be back at work. And coincidentally, though I don't believe in coincidences, April 14th or April 15th was Tamil New Year's Day. So our guys said, "It's a New Year's gift. We will announce it on April 15th."
Yeah,
I said, "No, 20 years we've done it. And this is the time when people really are very insecure. So let's do this."
absolutely.
We worked offline, of course, very little credit to me. My colleagues in HR, they bent their backs, they burnt the midnight oil. April 1, 2020, as always, we announced our year-end rewards, bonuses, everything. No, no salary cut.
Right,
We gave the increments as we would normally give. We paid out the bonuses as we would normally pay out. The only thing we held back was promotions. So we said because of the uncertainty, we will hold the promotions, but the rest of it is business as usual, right?
right,
And it was a difficult decision to make, but
right,
we thought about it long and hard, and we said it is at a time like this when we really need to support our people. In
right,
good times, it's very easy.
right,
At the time of uncertainty and fear is when we need to stand with our people and say, "Listen, we are there for you."
right. Absolutely. So that sort of very well explains the employee loyalty and very well explains the uh, customer the success that you've had with your customers. But the one thing that I want to touch upon is the growth aspect of it, right? Everyone loves growth. I mean, as private equity investors, we love growth, right? Shareholders want growth, and even if one looks at it from employee perspective, uh, at his own level, he would want growth, right? Because that to some extent determines the salary hike he gets, the bonus he gets, uh, and whether we like it or not, that growth comes at a cost, and it has its own, it creates its own issues. Uh, as 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 CEO of the company, how do you take care of all these constituents? And the two constituents that I'm talking about is really the shareholders and the employee at the branch level, the guy who earns 15-20,000 rupees, right? Who's really looking forward to that 2,000 or 3,000 rupee bonus, which depends on him meeting the targets, the disbursals, right? Even if they are not the best of the quality. These are the two constituents who really do not see the picture as you see as a CEO. And for you as a CEO, it may be personally okay to not grow for a year or two, but for these two constituents, it could turn out to be tough, right? From a shareholder's perspective, the price to book may go down from whatever 4 to 3, and that's a big negative, right? When everyone in the industry is growing and the stock price is doubling every year, it's a tough one for shareholders. And similarly, for the branch level guy, it's tough one if he doesn't get that 5,000 rupee bonus while his peer in another NBFC is making 5,000 rupees. I mean, he can switch over for that 5,000 rupees. So, how
Absolutely.
do you explain these things to these two constituents?
Okay. Very, very, very important question. And I think in many ways, this is at the core of our business philosophy. Uh, two things that I would say to you. One, I say this to my team all the time, that I see our business as a marathon race rather than as a 100-meter sprint, right? And what I've shared time and time again, and I do it frequently, is don't we don't measure ourselves by how well we are sprinting. We measure ourselves by, are we going to be one of the guys who will hit the tape at the end of 26 miles? So that is the basic philosophy that is ingrained in our people. So it's not about, what results are you showing next quarter. That's not to say we don't have quarterly metrics. Of course we do. We are also part of this larger tyranny of quarterly results and this and that and the other. So we do of course measure, but the understanding is very clear that this is a marathon race. It's not 100 meters sprint, number one. Number two, which is the thing I think investors, especially MNCs, foreign investors, find very difficult to understand about Sundaram Finance, is that we don't have something called a sales function. I mean, it sounds really weird, but we don't have a sales function because I believe that in this business, you cannot have something which is just sales, right? Sales without the responsibility to collect, you will only encourage, rashness. So in another sense, all of us are salesmen. I'm also a salesman, right? So therefore, we came up with this construct called GQP, which is a virtuous cycle called growth, quality, profitability. GQP, therefore, is the mantra. GQP is the compass. So how does GQP help? So every employee, including the kid at the branch that you're talking about, understands GQP. So he does not, unlike in many other institutions, he does not get a sales incentive. He gets a GQP incentive, right?
Okay.
The branch is the profit center. In fact, I tell my boys this, I tell my branch managers, I said, listen, each one of you is a managing director of a mini Sundaram Finance, right? We've given you a company to run, right? So you've got everything that I have as CEO of the big Sundaram Finance, you have in miniature. So you have to do your deals, you have to write your credit, you have to collect, you have to manage your expenses, you have to manage your credit costs, and finally you deliver me your bottom line. And what I do as CEO is I collect 600 bottom lines from 600 of my profit center heads. I put them all together and that becomes my number, which I present to my shareholders and my board, right? So we've sort of instilled this behavior in all of our branches, all of our people. So and it's a very transparent, transparent metric. People see this, when they get their bonuses at the end of the year, they get a sheet which clearly shows these were the KPIs, right? These are the things we signed for. This is how we did. And it's not, 0 or 1, right? If you didn't make your full number, you made 90% of your number, there's a reward for that, right? So it's not all or nothing. It's not a sweepstakes kind of thing. And the other thing, which consciously we've done, while we recognize individual brilliance, we do not support what I would call a superstar culture. There are no superstars, right? We're all in this together. We are a team, right? So there are no superstars, and even the bonuses are divided as team bonus and individual bonus. So we want to make sure that because, and this is a lesson I learned very early. See, it's the guys who go and meet the customer, the guys who do the deals, who are considered the glamour boys. But they wouldn't be able to do what they're doing if your cashier who manages the cash at the branch, your back-end guy who does all the documentation, if they don't do their job, you won't be the super salesman.
I agree.
Therefore, the reward is shared equally in the team. On top of that, if there is individual brilliance, that individual brilliance will get rewarded. Right? So,
incentives in NBFC is a topic that is of great interest to me. And if there is any academician in the audience, I'm sure there is a case study to be written on how Sundaram Finance sort of creates its incentive structure, because that's the most tricky thing to do in any NBFC. It's a very, it's an art, I should say. But let me just move on to what is perhaps the hottest topic to discuss, which is the impact of COVID in the vehicle finance space. We've spent quite a bit of time talking, and I would want actually to open up the session to question and answers. And people who have questions can either write in the questions section or they can raise hand. But before we go to the audience, sir, if I could have some commentary from you in terms of how you see the vehicle finance space getting impacted. Couple of ways in which you could probably answer this is you could sort of split this into segments, HCV, LCV, and car probably, and then the used and new piece. And ultimately what people want to understand is what's the peak, let's say 90 DPD that you would see in these segments, and what's the ultimate loss that one should expect over the next 12 months. Some commentary on that would be very helpful.
Okay. All the stuff that you asked me so far was relatively easy to answer because that was the truth, and that those were my experiences. Now we're getting into really dangerous territory because what you're essentially asking me to do is gaze into my crystal ball, which I will attempt to do, with the caveat that my crystal ball is not in any way superior to anybody else's crystal ball, right? So there are crystal balls aplenty, and with that caveat, I will gaze into my crystal ball. Now, I think it's first off, at least as far as MNHCV is concerned, I think it's important to recognize, and because COVID is such a big thing, we tend to forget. But the CV industry has been on a downward slide since October 2018, right? Soon after ILFS happened, right? That was the time the axle load norms got redone, right? The relaxation of axle load norms, which effectively increased truck capacity by anywhere between 20 and 25%. So it started from there. And if you see, sale of medium and heavy commercial vehicles since October 18, month on month, has been dropping, right? And of course, more recently, the drop was more precipitous, but it's been dropping. And with BS6 kicking in on April 1, we all knew, even as early as September, October 2019, we were projecting that 2020, anyway, for MLHCV is going to be a washout, right? Because already there's overcapacity. The economy is not going anywhere. I mean, GDP is dropping, it dropped to 5%. They're saying it will drop further. And, BS6 trucks are probably going to be more expensive by 20-25%, and they weren't even letting on how much. So with all this uncertainty, all of us, when I say we, not only in Sundaram Finance, but in the industry, I think the realization was, at least for the first half of FY21, forget about medium and heavy commercial vehicles. Let's spend our time talking about other stuff. And on top of that, COVID hit, right? Which was really the last straw. So now I think it looks even more dismal than it did a few months ago. And I would say the outlook, therefore, for new medium and heavy commercial vehicles is depressed. If that's the most optimistic word that I can find. I don't want to be more, brutal than that. But certainly, yes, the outlook for new, that is, which basically means sale of medium and heavy commercial vehicles, definitely, I think, this is going to be a rough year, on top of the rough year that we already had. Passenger car, actually, last year was bad, but the hope was that, with now BS6 coming in, and here the BS4 to BS6 transition was not that violent. I don't think we're looking at such big ticket size increases. So the general belief was that, buying will come back. But unfortunately, again, COVID got in the way. But interestingly now, I'm hearing that COVID actually could be a blessing for passenger car sales, because with distancing and with reluctance of people to use public transport, etc., you could find people graduating, for example, from two-wheelers into at least the entry segment cars, right? May not be the high-end SUV type, but certainly the entry segment, B segment cars, B plus C segment cars, and used cars, right? So there is increasingly now this belief. I'm not able to say that this will definitely happen, but I think there is a logic to this, because life has to, start flowing again. People have to get back to work, stuff has to move on. And therefore, I believe this could be, in this gloom, there could be an opportunity as far as passenger cars are concerned. As far as light commercial vehicles and the smaller commercial vehicles, I think there is indeed room for optimism. And there's two reasons for this. One, in all this mayhem, touch wood, there's one part of our economy, one part of our country, which is largely untouched. That's rural India, right? The pandemic has not affected, I hope, the people going back doesn't change that, but the pandemic thankfully hasn't messed with rural India too much. The agri story is fantastic. The harvest has been great. Procurement has been great. MSP, raised. Reservoirs are full. Planting for Kharif is, I believe, 40% higher than last year. And you have forecast for a normal monsoon. So actually, on the rural side, there is no bad news. Everything sounds very good. So, which is potentially good news from two or three sides. One, rural prosperity is good. So, hopefully, spending will happen, which is overall positive for the economy. Number two, tractors, farm equipment, other, light vehicles, all of that could be a big opportunity. And also, I think, after this 2, 3 month, whatever disruption and lockdown, I think there will be a need for goods to move, all kinds of goods, agri produce, but also other essential, non essential goods. Slowly, as life comes back, the e-commerce guys will swing back into action, and everyone who sort of put things on hold, they will now start loosening up. So I see the demand for freight, right, actually increasing in a relative sense, of course. So, which potentially means that for light and small trucks, there could be demand. And for the existing truckers, I think their capacity utilization will probably be better than it's been in a long time, right? And the last piece is infrastructure, right? Because I think now for many years, our country has depended on infrastructure as one of the big drivers of growth. I don't think it's different now. So once lockdown is completely lifted and the projects come back on stream, and I'm sure the government has more up its sleeve in terms of infrastructure push, I think that will act as another big impetus to some segments, at least, of the commercial vehicle industry from a utilization capacity utilization. So that's sort of the broad picture that I'm able to paint. As I said,
I must say you've painted a quite an optimistic picture of how things could look after this pain is over. I think a lot of people are interested in what's the peak that we are going to see. And if I look at the questions that are coming in, people are interested to know a couple of things, right? One is that this moratorium has now got extended to 6 months, which does something to the credit discipline. So one question which Shiva sir has asked is, what does it do to the credit discipline, and what does it do to the peak NPAs? What's the kind of multiplier that you would apply to normal times NPA, and what is it that you would see during this period? And as a follow-up to that, something that Varun has asked is, what does it do in the vehicle finance space particularly? Because there is an underlying asset in which the loan value is going up and the asset value is sort of going down as assets sort of keep depreciating. What does it do to these things?
see, I'm not going to hazard a guess on what the multiplier is going to be, because I don't think it's going to be one number. So it depends on each entity, depending on the mix, right, of your portfolio, whether you have more of one type of asset versus another type of asset. So that will vary by company. So I'm not going to hazard a guess there. But let me talk on the moratorium. See, the moratorium dynamic is slightly interesting. The moratorium one, right, if I can call it that, which was the March, April, May moratorium, when it happened, I think was absolutely essential, right? Because life had come to an abrupt standstill, right? The truck was going at 100 kmph, did a sudden brake, boom, right? Everything stopped. And there was zero clarity on where this was going, how it's going to pan out. So moratorium one was an absolute must. No doubt, it created a problem for the lenders, because the NBFCs, because they didn't get a back-to-back moratorium, there was confusion, all that mess was going on. But even allowing for that, from a a borrower point of view, it was absolutely critical.
Right.
Now, moratorium 2 is a slightly different animal because already life has started flowing back. Lifting of lockdown has already happened in large parts of the country. More is
Yeah.
happening, and hopefully by May 31st, full scale. I mean, your flights are starting on Monday. 200 trains are starting on June 1. So all the messages one is hearing are of going back to normal. Of course, one prays that there is no crazy spike, because of all this opening up. But it looks like we've come to a point where we are saying, yes, COVID is scary, etc. But in the debate between lives and livelihoods, we have now reached a point where we are saying we have taken care of lives, now we have to take care of livelihoods. That's the message that I'm hearing, right? I don't know if this is the policy thinking, but the actions on the ground are telling me this is the policy thinking, that we now have to let livelihoods and lives run parallelly. So if this is the case, in the months of in the months of June, July, and August, right, people are going to start earning. They will not be earning at, normal levels,
Yeah.
but cash flows are going to start, right? But there's going to be no corresponding EMI burden, right?
Yeah.
So you will be cash positive. And what I think is, if you are smart, what you will say to these guys is, listen, you've got literally a 6 month holiday, right? So if you are 2 months behind on February 29th when the break was applied,
Right.
for your own good, if you now pay 2 installments, even though you are on moratorium, you pay me 2 installments between now and August.
Yeah.
When the clock starts again on September 1,
You are zero DPD.
you will be zero delinquent.
Yeah.
Your credit history looks terrific, right? So, from the NBFC's point of view, they've brought down their delinquency. From the borrower's point of view, his credit record sheet looks clean. So, in some ways, you could argue that this can benefit both lender and borrower if you do this smartly, because this is a breather
Right.
more or
Right.
less that's been provided to the borrower to play catch up.
So you're saying in some ways NBFCs could use this to clean up their book and
NBFCs can use it, but equally, I'm saying borrowers can use this to remediate.
yeah.
Right? Because often in this business, what happens is small operator, he falls behind, he finds it very difficult to catch up.
Right.
This month, I can EMI, I can manage, but
Right.
I'm unable to catch up on my arrears.
Right.
But now you've been given this window, and if you're going to be earning, maybe not at your normal level, but if you're going to be earning something now, can you catch up at least partly,
Right.
right?
So one question that Sandeep Menon has asked is, in the new HCV segment, especially in large truck operators segment, is very competitive, right? And effectively the funding is like as he puts it, about 130% of the value of the truck. How do you see that segment behaving in this environment?
Yeah, see, uh, as they say, Jaisi Karni, Vaisi Barni. No? So if you've been either adventurous enough or stupid enough to do 130% funding, uh, I suppose you must be prepared to take the pain of that, right? Because these are sort of the, if you like, for 101
Lessons.
in this business, right?
Yeah,
So
sir. But if I can just extend that question, and given this event, do you expect at least in the short to medium term LTVs to go down or spreads to increase? Any of those changes that you expect in terms of future disbursements that people will do?
I think definitely credit filters will become tighter. 100% credit filters will become tighter. That could also mean LTVs could go lower. Margins, I'm not sure, because with all the successive policy rate cuts, banks now are sitting pretty, right? And for them, their CASA, since there is so much risk aversion, all the deposits are really funneling into the banks. So I don't think banks are going to put up their rates, or even if they put up their rates, they will still be sitting very pretty. So I don't think NBFCs in particular will have too much wiggle room to increase their spreads. I mean, for the good quality business, if you're competing with the bank, that becomes a limiting factor.
Right, right. Another question that has come is relating to truck sales. With so much of excess capacity already there, and the utilization levels will sort of pick up only slowly. Do you expect truck sales to remain extremely muted during this year?
Absolutely, absolutely. I
Okay,
mean, I
okay.
don't think I'd be very surprised to see, anything positive on drug sales.
Right, right. I think this is the last question that has come, and if anyone has any more questions, please type them in now. Bama has asked a question. Given the tightness and liquidity that NBFCs have seen in the last 1.5 years, do you see any of these two happening? One, do you see more consolidation happening in the NBFC space? And do you see some of them being pushed to become banks to take care of the liability side?
Consolidation, I can see happening, uh, especially with some of the smaller players, newer players, some in the MFI space. I can see consolidation happening. Bank is a different story because it's on paper it's very nice and attractive to say, oh, become a bank and your liabilities problem is fixed. But I'm afraid it doesn't quite work that way, because we have any number of banks, even in the public sector, who are struggling with CASA of 20 and 22. Right? Everybody is not an HDFC or State Bank of India whose CASA is running at 45 and 50. So that's not an easy fix that I put bank after my name and suddenly my liabilities problems are taken care of. It's a long, hard grind. It's about building credibility, it's building trust. So that I'm not so sure of. In fact, I don't think that will be the case. And Reserve Bank is going to be extremely choosy about permitting any new bank licenses to be issued. So I don't
If
see
I
that.
can, if I can sort of extend that question, market has clearly distinguished market has clearly distinguished between NBFCs, and there are a select few, and everyone else is in the other bucket, right? And that makes it really tough for NBFCs who are smaller and who are really servicing the MSME or the small customers, right? The used vehicle segment, the small guys, right? And despite that big utility that NBFCs serve, on the liability side, the question for a lot of them is unanswered. And regulator in some ways has given stepmotherly treatment to NBFCs. So
100.
so what is the solution for that? You mentioned that a regulator will be selective in terms of giving out banking license, and I don't disagree with you. I mean, that's the right thing to do, right? But but what's the solution? Ultimately, someone has to serve these customers, and NBFC is
100%.
doing a fantastic job. So how do we solve that?
100%. Actually, a lot of the advocacy that I have done individually and through our trade bodies is really for the smaller and mid-sized NBFCs who, as you say, are doing the last mile delivery. I think they do a phenomenal job in terms of delivery,
Yeah,
and they serve the underbanked segments of the economy, right? Which even people like us, the larger NBFCs, we cannot do because
yeah,
their understanding of those local nuances is something that is unmatched.
yeah, absolutely.
So that's the reason for the longest time we've been pushing, saying that through some instrumentality like SIDBI or through Mudra, there should be, like for example, housing finance companies have a national housing bank, NHB, which is a lender. They used to be lender come regulator, which is different, but they were the last resort lender to HFCs. So
Right.
we've been trying for the longest time that such an instrumentality is required. We haven't got there yet, but I must say that in the recent crisis, the fact that the finance minister has come out specifically with this 30,000 crore line and this 45,000 crore partial guarantee scheme, these are very good portents because at least now there is a recognition that there is this segment of the financial system which has been neglected, and as you know, the TLTROs were a flop
Yeah,
because we shouldn't touch this paper. So
yeah,
which is why the government finally came out and said 30,000 crore, we will do a full guarantee. I'm hoping that this is sort of the first step towards setting up a permanent, structural, institutional mechanism which will fund, these smaller NBFCs because this is a conviction born of 40 years in this industry.
right. So you are
What
saying essentially that there should be an NHB equivalent for NBFC.
correct, correct.
I think
Because
that's a fantastic one.
without that, there is no way, these guys can grow, and it will be a shame if you kill off, this segment of NBFCs. It
Right,
will really,
absolutely. Absolutely. The other option could be that these NBFCs sort of become the distribution partner for banks, right? Pretty much like a BC arrangement. Do you see the industry moving in that direction significantly?
some of it, the Reserve Bank came out with this co-origination thing a
Yeah,
couple of years ago, hasn't taken off that well. It's okay. There's a business correspondent model,
yeah,
there's a co-origination model.
yeah,
Those are okay. I have nothing against them, but
yeah,
that's not the full answer. The
yeah,
full answer is empower these small companies, empower the small and medium NBFCs. And it's unfortunate because you have high profile failures like ILFS and DHFL, the small guys get screwed, right?
yeah.
Grossly unfair. How many failures do you know of small NBFCs? You
Right.
ask any bank, he will tell you there's never been a small NBFC failure.
Right, right, right. And the other side of that is something that Rishabh is asking is, would you imagine some of these banks sort of moving into segments which till now have been catered mainly by NBFCs? So, for example, would you imagine some of the larger banks moving into, let's say, used vehicle financing and things like that? Would they sort of venture into that segment?
I imagine it depends. It depends on how much they have on their plate with their traditional businesses. If there isn't enough going on there, then I guess willy nilly they will look for greener pastures, right?
Yeah,
So that's something that's hard to predict, and it won't be everyone, right? Because it depends on each bank what their DNA is, what
absolutely.
their capabilities are. Some will, some won't, but it's an open field, so anybody can go into anything. So I think You should plan on the basis that, and as it goes, there is zero entry barrier, right? Anyone can come. So you should expect that.
Right, absolutely. Sir, I think we've answered most of the questions that have come. I think we've extended the 1 hour timeline by about 10 minutes. Thank you so much for your patience with me. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much once again.
Thanks, Amit. I hope this sort of met the expectations in terms of what people wanted to hear, and in terms of answering
Absolutely.
some of the questions they might have had. I'm sorry if I know I didn't always give you pinpointed answers, because 40 years is a long time, so you tend to sort of drift
In
away
fact,
into by lanes. So I'm sorry if some of that happened, but
in fact, I was pleasantly surprised that you were quite optimistic about the future. When I've been hearing gory predictions for a long period of time now.
no, this comes, I guess, from, and I say this every time, even when I'm on media and all of that. See, if you are invested in the India story, I mean, there's a basic question you have to answer. Do you believe in an India story, or don't you? If you don't believe in the India story, then yes, you can get as gloomy as you want. But if you are invested in an India story, and if you, and I'm not talking about competition with China, this that world's second largest. I'm not going anywhere there. But I'm saying, if you are invested in tomorrow, India will be a vibrant economy because of all the good reasons that have been put out. If you're invested in that, then you have to believe, okay, maybe it won't happen in the next 6 months, maybe it won't happen in the next 12 months, but beyond that, it has to happen. Or there is no India story, which is a different track.
Right. No, absolutely. All of us do believe in India's story, and we are, your optimism gives us great hope. On that optimistic note, thank you so much for joining in. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. God bless.